On the 15th day of the 4th month of the 7th year of the dynasty, the sky above the valley surrounding the holy city suddenly darkened, not because of storm clouds signaling a storm, but because of the giant layer of dust stirred up under the heels of 50,000 expeditionary troops. From the northern horizon, thousands of black flags covering the sky appeared, signaling the presence of the notoriously cruel Northern Empire army. The thunderous footsteps of tens of thousands of hobnailed boots pounding the ground created a dull sound, echoing like distant thunder, shaking the cups of water on the dining tables of the residents in the city. On the highest watchtowers of the holy city, columns of thick black smoke were quickly lit, rising straight into the high sky, signaling a state of total emergency. The sound of animal horn bugles roared long, mournful blasts, urging soldiers to rush to their battle positions. The guards, faces pale, looked down at the plain, where the black flood of the invading army was slowly pouring in, stretching for more than 10 miles. There was no cheering. There was no chaos. The northern army moved with steel discipline, forming giant chessboard squares, swords and spears bristling and gleaming under the harsh sun. Meanwhile, on the periphery, the invaders' vanguard cavalry, with over 2,000 lightly armored men and horses, immediately spread out to two wings. They galloped through orchards and fields, burning granaries that had not yet been moved, and slaughtering anyone who remained outside the city gates. Their goal was not a frontal attack, but to cut off all food supply routes and water sources leading into the city. The lucky farmers who escaped to the city gate recounted in horror about the iron-masked knights, cruel and fast as a whirlwind. By noon, 50,000 troops had finished deploying their battle formation, completely surrounding all four sides of the holy city's walls. Instead of ordering an immediate assault, the northern generals ordered the soldiers to set up camp. Thousands of cloth tents sprang up close together like mushrooms after rain, while the engineering corps began digging deep trenches and erecting spiked palisades facing the city walls to prevent any breakout attempts. Heavy wagons carrying large timber lumbered into the assembly position, preparing for the assembly of fearsome war machines. When night fell, tens of thousands of campfires were lit around the valley, turning night into day, forming a giant ring of fire tightening around the throat of the holy city. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and killing intent. No one in the city could close their eyes, for they knew that 6 months of hell of the most brutal siege in history had only just begun. The third day of the siege began not with a peaceful dawn, but with the rapid but brief sound of war drums from the northern camp. This was not the sound of a full-scale assault, but the deadly rhythm of a ruthless probing of forces. About 3,000 light infantry, wearing no heavy armor for easy movement, separated from the main formation and rushed towards the western wall. On their shoulders were hundreds of long bamboo and wooden ladders. The ends of the ladders were tipped with sharp iron to hook tightly into rock crevices. Shouts echoed to the heavens and earth to overwhelm the spirits of the defenders, straining their eyes looking down from above. Meanwhile, on the narrow defensive corridor, thousands of Holy City archers had taken their positions ready. The commanding generals ordered restraint, waiting for the enemy to enter the most effective kill zone. When the distance between the two sides was less than 100 paces, the signal was given, and the sky was immediately obscured by a thick rain of black arrows screaming through the wind, crashing down. The arrows fired from above carried terrifying kinetic energy, piercing through fragile wooden shields and embedding into the flesh of the siege troops. Chaos of painful screams rang out as hundreds of northern soldiers fell, blood staining the dry, barren ground red before they could even touch the foot of the wall. Despite heavy casualties, the reckless stream of people still flooded to the foot of the wall like fierce waves crashing against a cliff. The sound of clattering wood rang out continuously as dozens of ladders were erected, pressing close against the towering high wall. The northern soldiers held short knives horizontally in their mouths, using both hands and feet to climb nimbly up like a colony of ants, trying to overcome the height of more than 20 meters of the solid city wall before being shot down. At the edge of the wall, close-quarters combat exploded bloody. As soon as the first helmets of the invaders poked up above the wall's edge, they were immediately greeted by sharp, long spear blades thrusting straight into their faces and chests. The defending soldiers combined their strength, using long poles to push hard against the tops of the ladders, throwing both the ladder and the people off the fulcrum. The ladders toppled backward in a chain effect, carrying clusters of soldiers falling to the ground, shattering bones. Large rocks were thrown down mercilessly, crushing those who were trying to re-erect the ladders below. After nearly 2 hours of fierce fighting without capturing any high ground, the mournful sound of the retreat horn from the north rang out. The surviving soldiers hurriedly retreated out of arrow range, leaving behind hundreds of corpses lying scattered, piled on top of each other at the foot of the wall. The probing attack ended with a temporary victory for the defenders, but the atmosphere on the ramparts was still heavy with anxiety, because everyone understood that the enemy was only using soldiers' blood to test the durability of the stone and the placement of crossbows. After the bloody failure of the first attack, the battlefield fell into a state of artificial silence that lasted for 10 days. However, that silence was quickly broken by a sound even more terrifying than the clash of swords and spears. The sound of hammers, saws, and wood striking resounding day and night without rest. At a safe distance, about 400 paces from the city wall, just far enough to avoid the range of the largest crossbows, the Northern Army began the assembly of great war machines never before seen. Thousands of large ironwood trunks transported from distant border forests were pulled by the strength of tens of thousands of slaves and livestock, piled up high as mountains in the middle of the plain. Under the hands of skilled engineering corps, giant wooden skeletal frames gradually took shape, rising majestically in the middle of the bare plain, obscuring a corner of the sky. They were 3 giant siege chariots, each with a height of up to 60 meters, far exceeding the height of the highest watchtower in the Holy City. From the ramparts, the defending generals and soldiers looked down with eyes of dismay and despair. They witnessed wooden wheels 10 meters in diameter being fitted to the axles, so large that it required 60 of the strongest bulls to pull it inch by inch. On the lower levels of the wooden tower, hundreds of fresh cowhides, just skinned, still dripping blood and reeking of a strong fishy stench, stretched to cover the entire front and both sides to resist fire attacks. The foul stench blew straight into the faces of the guards, causing nausea and chills. Night fell. Torchlight from the construction area shone brightly like a second city springing up opposite the Holy City. The monotonous clop-clop sound of hammers driving iron nails into hard wood echoed regularly like the heartbeat of death, torturing the spirits of the army and people in the city. Each beat was a cruel reminder that their time of existence was running out with every grain of wood joined. Not a single arrow had been fired in the last 10 days. But the invisible pressure from those forming moving mountains weighed heavier on the defenders' shoulders than 1,000 pounds of iron. Inside the wooden tower, a complex system of staircases was designed to hold 500 heavy infantry at once. On top of the tower, giant plank bridges were suspended by iron chains as thick as an adult's wrist, black and cold, ready to be lowered at any time to create a deadly path leading straight into the heart of the city. This meticulous preparation and terrible scale signaled that when the next attack broke out, it would no longer be a probe, but total destruction. Early morning of the 14th day, when the mist had not yet cleared over the valley, the attack signal with a crimson flag was waved from the Northern Central Army. Immediately, more than 80 heavy stone-throwing machines arranged in an arc behind the infantry formation fired simultaneously. The sound of twisted ropes snapping tight and wooden arms swinging up created a deadly chord, tearing apart the silence of the dawn. The sky was momentarily obscured by hundreds of large stone blocks, each boulder weighing more than 50 kilograms, flying swiftly through the air like a swarm of meteorites crashing down on the Holy City. The first boulders collided with the city wall, creating loud explosions like lightning striking straight into the ground. The outer stone cladding of the city wall, though existing for hundreds of years, now crumbled into large chunks, spraying sharp fragments into the air. A watchtower in the east corner took 3 consecutive hits from large boulders striking its base, shaking violently, then collapsing completely in a cloud of blinding dust, burying 20 crossbowmen guarding atop it. The sound of crashing bricks and stones mixed with the pinnacle screams of soldiers trapped under the rubble created a scene of extreme chaos. On the city wall, the defensive army fell into a completely passive situation. Wooden shields or leather armor became useless against the destructive power of the giant boulders. Just one direct hit, and both person and shield were crushed into unrecognizable piles of mixed flesh. The commanding generals were forced to order soldiers to retreat from the wall's edge, hiding deep in fortified stone bunkers or behind secondary barrier walls to preserve forces. The once crowded city wall now became desolate, leaving only deep craters and scattered rubble. However, the rain of stones did not stop at the city wall. The Northern Army engineers adjusted the shooting range, sending the stones over the perimeter wall, falling straight into the residential area inside. Fragile tiled roof houses were smashed to pieces. Fire began to flare up from overturned stoves, spreading to markets and warehouses. Smoke and dust billowed up from the inner city, obscuring vision and causing suffocation for those trying to extinguish the fire. For 12 continuous hours, the sound of falling rocks and collapsing structures never ceased. The siege army took turns loading ammunition, keeping the firing rate uninterrupted for even a moment. When twilight fell, the western section of the wall was seriously chipped, jagged like the teeth of an old monster, and the defensive moat below was partially filled by the piles of shattered bricks and stones falling from above, unintentionally creating small ramps for infantry to climb up in subsequent attacks. As the first rays of sun on the 15th day shone down on the rubble-strewn battlefield, the sound of the horn, urging the army, but rang out with a completely different tune, deep, slow, and full of power. It was the signal for the 3 giant siege chariots to begin moving. 3 towering wooden mountains separated from the formation, trudging towards the city wall with a slow but unstoppable speed. The sound of giant wooden wheels grinding against iron axles emitted ghastly shrieking sounds, ear-piercing screeching, echoing throughout the valley like the growls of prehistoric monsters hungering for food. On the city wall, defensive generals screamed orders for soldiers to return to battle positions despite the danger. Hundreds of large cauldrons of oil were boiled vigorously right on the spot, billowing smoke, ready for the decisive moment. When the chariots entered a range of about 300 paces, the archers on the wall released their strings simultaneously. Thousands of arrows wrapped in pine resin-soaked rags burning brightly flew out, creating long trails of fire tearing through the wind, embedding straight into the front of the wooden towers. However, the Northern Army's preparation had taken maximum effect. The fire arrows plunging into the water-soaked fresh cowhide covering the tower only emitted the hissing sound of water meeting fire, and then extinguished, leaving behind thin wisps of white smoke. Not a single flame could flare up on that slippery and wet surface. The chariots still advanced looming large, ignoring all arson attempts. Their giant black shadows gradually covered the city wall, obscuring the sun and plunging the defensive soldiers into a creepy darkness. When the distance remained only a few dozen paces, the soldiers on the wall risked their lives leaning out, throwing down hundreds of barrels of boiling oil and molten asphalt. The deadly black and golden liquid stream poured straight down to the foot of the tower, where hundreds of slaves and engineer soldiers were straining to push the cart. Heart-rending screams rang out as human flesh contacted the boiling oil. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the smell of damp wood created a suffocatingly nauseating atmosphere. Dozens of people fell down, writhing in pain, but immediately the reserve squad from behind rushed up to fill the gap, trampling on the bodies of comrades to continue pushing the machine forward. Despite casualties reaching hundreds in just the last few minutes of movement, the inertia of the 1,000-ton wooden blocks still prevailed. With a strong collision shaking the entire long section of the city wall, 3 siege chariots rammed hard into the earth embankment at the foot of the wall, wheels sinking deep into the mud, fixing the position firmly. Now, the top of the wooden tower was level with, or even higher than, the edge of the city wall, and from inside that safe shell, the sound of clashing swords and spears and the heavy breathing of 500 shock troops, waiting for the moment to lower the bridge, was clearly audible to the defending soldiers. The ear-piercing screech of giant iron chains being suddenly released rang out, drowning out the chaotic cheering of both sides. 3 thick wooden plank bridges, weighing tons, slammed down from the top of the wooden towers onto the city wall surface with terrifying inertia. The large iron hooks at the end of the bridge plunged into the stone foundation, gripping the wall's edge tightly, creating a solid path connecting the death machine with the holy city's final line of defense. Stone dust flew blindly at the point of impact, and just before the dust could settle, the real nightmare began. From the belly of the wooden towers, a flood of soldiers clad in pitch-black iron armor poured out, the sound of thundering footsteps shaking the entire section of the city wall. The leading soldiers carried large rectangular shields, forming a moving wall, using their body weight to ram hard into the ranks of the defensive troops, trying to block the bridgehead. The sound of collision between 2 masses of metal and flesh rang out with a dry thud, like two bulls locking horns, followed by the sound of breaking bones and screams of pain compressed tightly within chests. On the city wall corridor, less than 5 meters wide, the narrow space made the battle doubly cruel. There was no room for dodging or technical flourishes, only stabbing and pushing. Long spears from behind stabbed through the gaps between the shields, seeking the throats and faces of the enemy. Battle axe blades chopping down from above, splitting helmets and skulls, fresh blood spraying profusely, dyeing the mossy green stone slabs red, making the floor deadly slippery. Soldiers who slipped and fell were immediately trampled by dozens of hobnailed boots until crushed, unrecognizable in form. Meanwhile, at the East Tower intersection, pressure from the endless stream of troops pouring over pushed the defensive army back step by step. The Holy City soldiers in the front row were pressed tight against the stone railing behind their backs, with no way to retreat. Under the 1,000-pound pressure of the rushing enemy mass, the old stone railing cracked and crumbled. Dozens of soldiers, both attackers and defenders, hugging each other tightly in a struggling posture, then fell together into the abyss more than 20 meters below. Their screams were silenced when their bodies hit the hard ground, leaving messy piles of corpses at the foot of the wall. Although the defenders fought with the recklessness of those backed into a corner, but the stream of reinforcements from the wooden tower continued to pour out ceaselessly. For every northern soldier who fell, 2 others stepped over their comrade's body to take their place. The advantage in numbers and equipment began to crush the will to resist. The defensive line on the wall was gradually torn into small, isolated groups. The sound of clashing metal rang out harshly all around, signaling the inevitable collapse of the Holy City's protective shell. While blood was staining the high corridors red, on the ground, another battle no less brutal was taking place right in front of the Holy City's main gate. From within the Northern Army formation, a battering ram carefully shielded by a thick iron-plated oak arched roof slowly moved into position. Beneath the canopy, 60 muscular soldiers, bare-chested and dripping with sweat, were operating together a 12-meter-long ironwood trunk, tipped with an iron block shaped like a buffalo head, weighing over 4,000 caddies. The chant 2, 3, heave rang out regularly, harmonizing with the urging war drums. The giant wooden block suspended on massive chains swung back to gain momentum, then swung forward powerfully according to the pendulum principle. A loud boom rang out earth-shakingly every time the iron head collided with the 3-inch thick ironwood door of the city gate. Each blow shook the watchtower above, causing mortar dust to fall down like a shower of rain, and the iron locking bars inside the gate groaned and creaked as if about to shatter under the 1,000-pound pressure. Inside the gate, chaos and fear engulfed the defensive army. Hundreds of soldiers were hastily mobilized to carry large rocks, sandbags, and piles of scrap wood to wedge behind the door, trying to reinforce the violently shaking defensive layer. Every time the boom rang out from outside, the soldiers leaning their shoulders to hold the door felt their chests as if struck by a sledgehammer. The shockwave transmitted through the wood grain, numbing their arms and shoulders. Blood trickled from the ears and noses of those standing closest due to the immense sound pressure in the enclosed space. Outside, the gate-breaking army was also not left in peace. From the murder holes above the gate arch, the defenders poured down a series of barrels of boiling oil and hot sand. Although there was a protective roof, hot oil still found its way through the cracks, dripping onto the bare backs and shoulders of those pushing the ram. Screams of pain rang out from under the chassis, but the leather whips of the overseers lashed down continuously, forcing the wounded to continue pushing, or be dragged out and thrown aside for others to take their place immediately. The machine was not allowed to stop. After nearly 2 hours of continuous torture, large cracks began to appear on the surface of the 1,000-year-old ironwood door. A large chunk of wood in the middle was punched out, creating a hole the size of a shield. Immediately, dozens of long spears from outside stabbed through that hole, skewering the soldiers trying to wedge sandbags inside. In response, the Holy City's crossbow team put their eyes to the hole, firing extremely powerful close-range arrows outward, embedding into the chests and necks of the gate-breaking army. Blood from both sides sprayed through the hole, mixing together to form dark red puddles right under the threshold, while the battering ram continued to strike ceaselessly, signaling the moment of total collapse of the main gate was approaching very near, when the first cool breezes of autumn blew through the valley, signaling that 6 long months of the siege had passed. The battlefield situation had shifted from open, bloody skirmishes to a more cruel and silent underground war. Inside the Holy City, hunger and plague had become enemies more terrifying than the swords and spears outside. The last food store had run out 3 weeks ago, forcing the army and people in the city to eat everything from tree roots and rats to even thoroughly boiled shoe leather. Bodies dead from the plague lay scattered on street corners, with no one having the strength to bury them, emitting a strong stench of death covering the entire dying city. Realizing that the resistance of the defenders was still persistent thanks to the complex internal trench system, the northern generals decided to launch the most dangerous strike at the fatal weakness of the citadel, the southern wall section. This was the area with the weakest ground, located on an old underground water vein. Taking advantage of moonless nights black as ink, a special engineer corps of 500 men, nicknamed the Moles, began digging a large tunnel starting from a ravine hidden from view, aiming straight for the foundation of the city wall. The work took place in the damp and narrow darkness of the underground, where the air was thick with the smell of clay and sweat. The tunnel soldiers worked in continuous shifts, using short pickaxes and iron shovels to gouge out every inch of soil. For every meter of ground advanced, they erected sturdy oak frames to support the tunnel ceiling, preventing soil and rocks from collapsing and crushing the formation. The sound of pickaxes hitting rock only produced dull thumping sounds, swallowed by the thick layer of earth, making it difficult for the defenders above to detect the exact location, even if they pressed their ears to the ground. After 20 days and nights of digging without rest, the tunnel had eaten deep right under the foundation of the southern wall section. Here, the engineer corps expanded the space into a large room, replacing the entire load-bearing soil layer under the wall foot with a forest of support pillars made of oil-soaked wood and flammable pine resin. Thousands of bundles of dry straw, lard, and kindling were stuffed tightly into the spaces between the wooden pillars, turning the foundation of the solid city wall into a giant furnace waiting for the spark. Above, the guards began to feel abnormal slight vibrations under their feet, as if the earth was shivering with a chill. Small cracks began to run along the stone wall body, mortar dust falling scattered, even though no stones were being fired. A feeling of extreme insecurity spread through the defensive ranks, but all attempts to counter-tunnel or search were too late. The northern mining army had quietly retreated outside, leaving behind a slow fuse made of oil-soaked rope hundreds of meters long, leading to the tunnel entrance, ready to trigger the artificial earthquake that would bury the holy city's last hope. As soon as the fire from the tunnel entrance caught the straw and the supporting wooden pillars inside the earth, a deep, dull explosion like the moan of Mother Earth rang out, shaking a vast region. In the next few suffocating breaths, the southern wall section, more than 30 meters long, began to tilt, then suddenly collapsed as if pulled into the earth by a giant invisible hand. The sound of bricks and stones crashing and breaking created a horrifying sound, so piercing that it deafened the ears of all soldiers on both sides. A giant column of ash-gray dust rose billowing up, completely obscuring the sunlight, turning noon into a gloomy twilight. When the dust had not yet settled, the sound of the attack horn from the northern army tore through the misty screen. Tens of thousands of heavy infantry, who had been lying in wait not far away, simultaneously rushed forward with earth-moving momentum. They flooded over the filled-in trenches, climbing up the jagged pile of rubble just formed to penetrate the inner city. But on the other side of the rubble, the Holy City defenders, though exhausted from hunger, also rushed forward with the desperation of those with no way back. Two waterfalls of people collided right on top of the ruins, creating a scene of chaos and cruelty never before seen. At this newly opened Death's Door, tactical formation was completely broken. No more rows, no more commanders, only naked survival instinct remained. Soldiers trampled on sharp and slippery rock blocks to find footing, swinging swords and spears to kill any figure not wearing their side's uniform color. Visibility was severely restricted by dense stone dust, causing many soldiers to mistakenly stab their own comrades, or be killed by spear tips thrust stealthily from the mist. The harsh sound of clashing metal mixed with frenzied screaming, echoing in the narrow space of the wall breach. Fresh blood flowed profusely, soaking into the mortar dust, creating a thick red mud sticking under the soldiers' feet. Corpses began to fall from the top of the rubble pile, rolling uncontrollably down to the foot of the slope, piling up on each other, creating natural obstacles. Soldiers coming later were forced to climb over the bodies of those before them to reach the enemy. At times, the bodies piled so high they obscured the view, turning the wall breach into a literal wall of flesh and bone, stopping the advance of the attacking army for a moment. Although the Northern Army had an overwhelming advantage in numbers, but the treacherous terrain of the rubble turned this place into a funnel of death, where numbers could not be effective. The defensive army utilized the higher ground from the inside, rolling rocks down and throwing short-range spears into the crowding mass below. However, continuous pressure from thousands of soldiers behind kept pushing forward, forcing the northern soldiers in the front row tightly onto the spear points of the defenders, dying in a standing position, unable to fall. The slaughter at the southern hole lasted for 4 hours, turning this place into a mass grave for over 3,000 soldiers from both sides in just one afternoon. When the last blood-red sunset faded behind the western mountain range, the defensive line at the wall breach officially broke under the unstoppable pressure of the flood of invading troops. Tens of thousands of northern soldiers, after trampling on the bodies of comrades to cross the rubble pile, began to flood into the inner city like water bursting a bank. However, they quickly realized that crossing the city wall was not yet victory, but stepping into another gate of hell, street warfare. The square, disciplined phalanx formations that were the pride of the empire now shattered into fragments. When weaving into the dense network of narrow, winding, and dark alleys of the Holy City, the war shifted to the most chaotic and brutal form, where individual skills and recklessness took the throne instead of methodical tactics. Every house, every street corner, every window turned into a small but extremely dangerous fortress of resistance. From the closely packed rooftops, remnants of the defensive team threw down whatever they had, from bricks and tiles, flower pots, to broken tables and chairs. Ceramic jars filled with kerosene were thrown down into narrow alleys, followed by a fire starter, turning an entire squad of 10 northern soldiers into living torches, screaming and running wildly in the cramped space with no exit. On the ground, the invaders frantically broke down doors to storm into each house, hunting for the enemy. The sound of breaking wood, shattering furniture, and screams rang out from all the street blocks. In the cramped rooms, long spears became useless and cumbersome. Soldiers on both sides threw away main weapons to draw daggers and short axes, rushing to wrestle on the floor, stairs, and even on beds. Blood splattered on the white lime walls, soaking the exquisite woven carpets. There was no mercy, no prisoners. Northern soldiers slaughtered anyone holding a weapon, while the city people used kitchen knives and clubs to fight back in extreme desperation. To deal with the persistent resistance from high-rise buildings, Northern generals ordered the implementation of a brutal scorched earth policy. Squads of soldiers holding torches ran along the main streets, setting fire to the dry wooden house rows. The fire met the dry autumn wind and flared up violently, spreading quickly from roof to roof at breakneck speed. Black smoke rolled up, covering the night sky, turning a corner of the city into a glowing sea of fire. The terrible heat melted even metal, forcing defenders to jump from heights or suffocate in their own homes. Meanwhile, in the large squares, scattered groups of Holy City troops tried to regroup to establish blocking positions, but were quickly overrun and trampled by Northern cavalry. The sound of hooves tapping rapidly on the stone pavement mixed with the sound of swords slashing into flesh, creating a symphony of death. Bodies lay scattered across intersections and junctions, blood flowing along drainage ditches converging in low-lying areas, dyeing the ornamental lakes in the city red. By midnight, more than half the city was submerged in fire and blood, but the sound of clashing swords did not rest in the areas not yet occupied. While blazing red fire consumed the residential areas below, the remnants of the defense force, about 2,000 survivors, retreated to the central temple area, located on the city's highest hill, for a death stand. This was the last strategic high ground, surrounded by white stone walls and hundreds of steep steps, where they swore to fight to the last breath to protect the most sacred place. The Northern Army, after clearing out small pockets of resistance, quickly tightened the siege ring around the foot of the hill, forming a pitch-black sea of people vibrating to the rapid beat of war drums. The attack on the hill began with a terrible rain of fire arrows never seen before. Thousands of Northern archers lined up at the foot of the hill, simultaneously firing burning pine resin-soaked arrows upwards in a rainbow trajectory. The night sky was brilliantly lit by tens of thousands of fire specks soaring up, falling like meteors into the temple grounds. The precious cedar wood domes, dried out over hundreds of years, immediately burst into violent flames. Fire spread quickly through the corridors, licking up the velvet curtains and carved wooden columns, turning the sacred place into a giant furnace, trapping the defending soldiers inside a circle of heat and toxic smoke. Meanwhile, on the marble steps leading to the main temple gate, the invaders' heavy infantry began a bloody charge. Due to the narrow and steep staircase terrain, they were forced to advance in a column formation, using shields to cover their heads to avoid rocks and boiling water poured down from above. The defending soldiers stood in a horizontal line at the top of the slope, taking advantage of the height to thrust long spears down, penetrating the gaps between the enemy's shields. Each precise thrust caused a northern soldier to fall backward, rolling down, dragging dozens of people behind him down like dominoes. Blood from the corpses on the steps flowed down, dyeing the pure white of the marble red, creating deadly slippery crimson streams. Screams mixed with the crackling of fire and the sound of collapsing wooden structures created a chaotic scene. Despite casualties piling up filling the walkway, the Northern Army still trudged forward, stepping over comrades' bodies, step by step, narrowing the distance. The huge disparity in numbers made the defenders' efforts like trying to stop a flood with bare hands. They were exhausted, weapons blunt, and gradually pushed deep inside the burning temple courtyard. When the fire had softened the iron hinges and consumed part of the doorframe, the large gate leading to the main sanctuary finally collapsed after a powerful ram from a large wooden log used as a temporary battering ram. The sound of cracking wood rang out like the spine of a giant beast being snapped, throwing open the entrance for the final nightmare. The Northern Army flooded into the inner sanctuary like water bursting a bank, their sword blades reflecting the blazing red fire, bloodthirsty and cruel. Inside the vast main hall, where thick black smoke obscured even the majestic divine statues, the final battle took place at extremely close range. No more formation, no more tactics, only wild slashes and desperate screams remained. The last defending soldiers, backs against the altar, swung swords fighting back madly before being pierced by dozens of spear tips simultaneously. Blood splattered onto the gilded reliefs, onto the polished granite floor. The sound of clashing metal faded away, replaced by the moans of the wounded and the heavy footsteps of the victors checking every hidden corner to ensure no one survived. On the highest tower of the temple, a northern soldier chopped down the holy city's signal flag and threw it into the sea of fire below. Instead, the invaders' black flag with a wolf head was raised, fluttering in the hot wind and smoke, signaling the end of a dynasty. Looking down from above, the entire once prosperous city was now just a pile of glowing ashes, columns of black smoke rising high into the sky like giant tombstones. When the dawn of the next day broke, the noise of battle had completely disappeared, giving way to a terrifying, deadly silence covering the valley. 50,000 northern troops stood silently amidst the desolate ruins, surrounded by corpses of both sides lying scattered across every path, from the foot of the shattered wall to the steps of the blackened temple. The holy city had fallen after 6 months of resilience, wiped off the map not by time, but by iron, blood, and fire.